Welcome to the St. Louis University Craft Talks, part of the St. Louis Literary Award series of programming with our host, Ted Iber, and special guest, Edward McPherson. The St. Louis Literary Award was created by the Library Associates of St. Louis University in 1967. To learn more about the Literary Award and the writers that we have honored over the years, check out the book The St. Louis Literary Award by St. Louis University Archivist Emeritus John Wade. We would also like to thank our sponsors for the Craft Talk series, Left Bank Books and Caldy's Coffee Roasting Company. Left Bank Books is one of the oldest and largest independently owned bookstores in the nation, offering a full line of new and used books, gifts, cards, magazines, toys, and services. You can order works by Edward McPherson at a 20% discount if you let them know that you saw this interview. Caldy's Coffee Roasting Company is dedicated to creating a memorable coffee experience for their customers and guests, committing to sustainable business practices, providing educational opportunities, and supporting the communities in which they serve. And now, without further ado, Edward McPherson.
Welcome to St. Louis University's Craft Talks, part of the St. Louis Literary Award series of programs. My name is Ted Iber, and I'm the Executive Director for the St. Louis Literary Award. I would like to welcome our guest, Edward McPherson. Edward is the author of 3 books, Buster Keaton, Tempest in a Flat Hat, The Backwash Squeeze and Other Improbable Feats, The History of the Future, American Essays. Edward has written for the New York Times Magazine, the Paris Review, the American Scholar, Gettysburg Review, Salon, Guernica, the Southern Review, and New York Observer, and there are many others. I left a bunch off the list. My guest has also received many awards, including a Pushcart Prize, the Penn Southwest Book Award, the Gulf Coast Prize in Fiction, an Artist Fellowship from the Regional Arts Commission of St. Louis, and I was there when he got it, a Minnesota State Arts Board grant, and the Gesell Award from the University of Minnesota, where he received his MFA. Edward is a contributing editor for the Common Reader at Washington University in St. Louis, where he is also an associate professor of English, and that's where you'll also find him teaching creative writing. Edward McPherson, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff today, and I wanted to kick it off with some questions on writing process. And so let's just dive right into it. So you said that early on in writing The History of the Future, you knew that your work would never be complete, having left out stories from the Deep South and Minnesota, even though you had ideas for both of them. How do you reconcile the feeling of that kind of incompleteness with the knowledge that the book must end? And then the big question, how do you decide when a work is complete?
When they've wrestled it out of your cold, dead hands, Ted. I mean, I'm joking, but like, of course, writers are the kind of neurotic obsessives who will argue over punctuation for years. So, I mean, the short answer is if you have a deadline, then you're really lucky because you have to turn it in. Although, of course, deadlines can be extended. I think more generally, it's, I mean, particularly that book, which was like very much about, or at least there were some essays in it that acknowledged the failure of things that try to pretend to a completeness that's impossible, right? Like things like World's Fairs and the idea that you can cram a city into an essay. So already these failed endeavors. I think that book was a little easier for me to think, well, it's going to end when I run out of questions and it's never going to be complete. And because all books are sort of failed projects that can be beautiful nonetheless. So that one I knew was, but I think in terms of sort of more generally, I think form can tell you when you're done. As you're writing a book, you'll settle into a groove and you'll decide that it has a shape at some point. Maybe that's in revision, but you'll realize, ooh, there's a shape. So for like my last book, which was a series of essays, which of course you could keep adding essays to forever, right. There was a sort of westward progression. And when I ended up in LA, I thought, okay, well, this is the end. It was also vaguely chronological. We were leading up to the 2016 election, although the book was finished before then. And I thought, okay, well, here's a place maybe not to end, but to rest. So the form helped me decide. It doesn't mean I'm not going to sort of tinker with the essays ad nauseum, but I thought, okay, no more new essays. And I'd also run out of questions. Like if there was a place I was burning to go or a topic I really wanted to address, I would have done it. But I'd kind of, run out of questions, I think. So it was time to end.
I like that the geographic end of things helped helped you put that final period in. You'd reach the coast. Although now I think for book 2, you start in Hawaii.
Just keep going.
You're moving further west.
I should also, if you have trusted readers, that can help too, like an editor or a first reader, because they can often, when your nose is pressed up against a book, you can't see the forest for the trees, but they might be the kind of gentle soul to sort of pat you on the head and say, there, you're done. Now go tinker with the grammar.
You've mentioned that you're too superstitious in the early stages of a book to talk too much about the idea, or else you lose interest, and I can so relate. How do you remain interested in a topic as you're writing, and what role does that interest play throughout the whole writing process on any one project?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, writing is, I don't want to romanticize the hardship, but it's difficult, right? It's uncomfortable, it's lonely. You remove yourself and go into your little hobbit hole to get it done. You're sort of turning down invitations with families and friends, and it's frustrating. You kind of beat your head against the computer for days, weeks, years. All that said, it should still be fun. I mean, there should be a sense of play. And if you're not enjoying the writing beyond like what I guess might be called a normal amount of resistance, then the answer is maybe put it down, go do something else. But so focus on the sense of play. When you're writing, it's not like dutiful. Nobody cares if you write or not in America right now. So, if you think, oh, I ought to crank out one more essay about this or write a book about that, you don't have to. So if you're bored, it's your own fault. Like, write the bits that you want to write and then ignore everything else. And I think that's what helps it. You started because there was something interesting. And if you focus on that interest and let your interest be your guide, that can be a way of kind of keeping the balloon up in the air.
I've had students who have addressed that before, thinking, well, aren't you writing for the audience? Are you really writing for yourself?
Yeah, and it's both, right? Writing is a solitary endeavor that you do. You go deep within yourself, even when you're writing about something external to yourself. You're going deep within yourself. There is always a social end, right? You want to share something with the reader. But it starts with you, right? Because this is your book and your point of view. And if you try to endlessly anticipate the reader or all readers, it's a great way to shut yourself down. There's a balance there, right? You want to connect, but you also have to kind of put on the blinders and trust your own weird instincts and see where they lead you.
Yeah, very much so. My advice is always ignore that potential audience. They're great if they're there, but at this point, you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, I think especially in a first draft, I tell my students all the time, first draft is, and even like a polished first draft that they bring to workshop or something, that they've written a couple of versions of, but it's still an official first draft and that it finally feels done, however momentary that feeling might be. In that first draft, they're telling the story to themselves. They're just figuring out what to say. They don't know what they think until they articulate it. And at least that's certainly how it is for me. And then in later revisions, in a second, third, fourth draft, that's when you tell that story to a reader. And I think that's the important sort of consideration. But in our first drafts are often mysteries to ourselves.
So if you could talk a little bit about Tempest in a flat hat and your approach to gathering and organizing research. Are there any particular writing apps that you like to use or programs that you prefer?
Oh, I wish I had something really cool and jazzy to say here. No, I use like Word documents. I collect my research in Word documents just because that's simplest to me. I have students who use all sorts of cool note-taking hacks. But for me, it's a book and a Word document, and I'll keep sort of a running list of ideas that won't live in a particular Word document. So I don't have anything, I think, super unique to say about this. But the one thing I always do is that while I'm researching, no matter what, I'm still writing. And I think that's important because you can go down the rabbit hole of obsessively organizing and storyboarding and footnoting ad nauseum. And these things can be really important, but they're not, they're also a great way to keep yourself from writing. So I always write while I research, even if it's just little snippets in another document while I'm taking very careful notes from a source. Because again, it's that sense of play, but also a sense of knowing when you have to stop. with the research and organizing, because there's always another book you should read, right? You're writing about silent film. There's always going to be another silent film you should see,
right,
or a book you should read. And writers are famous procrastinators. And again, at some point you have to realize you got to stop.
Well, that actually brings me to the question about where you get your ideas from. What sparks you?
I mean, as a nonfiction writer who, I would say the world. I keep a document on my computer, and I think it's called like bits, and it's just little snippets I find, and that could be it could be in a book, right? I read a lot particularly when I'm not teaching, and I have more control over my reading life. Constantly reading. I think going to events like a poetry reading, a movie, seeing a concert, and things that are outside of your wheelhouse, right? Like someone else's favorite band, or a poet that you have never heard of, or a movie that a friend drags you to. I think those are where you get your ideas. It's just kind of being alive to the world, and something out there then rhymes with something inside, right? You see something in the world that rhymes with your inner life, and you think, that's, maybe I'll write about that. And then I collect all those, and eventually the one I have the most questions about, I'll sort of start fiddling around with.
So that would lead me to writing habits. What is if you're working on a project, what does a typical day look like for you?
Well, because I'm very fortunate to teach, but I'd say during the semester and even over the break, my work week is, at least Monday through Thursday, and usually Monday through Friday till 2:00 in the afternoon, occupied by grading, prepping, reading for class, students, reading applications, writing letters of rec, all those duties that I'm happy to do. People did them for me, and right, I love teaching, but writing life could be squeezed in on Fridays. Summer is a great gift of time. And then, I'm the kind of person who would write 24/7 if I could. I love exercising and my wife and child, but I also am monomaniacal in that I would happily sit by myself in a room and write for most of the day. So I'm happiest when I get to do that and then go home and see folks. But and that's my process.
I had this. Are you familiar with Lee Gutkind, nonfiction writer? Yeah, kind of the godfather of creative nonfiction. And I had taken a course with him at Arizona State University, and I had this question for him because he seemed this constant ball of energy. Always had his hand in something. And I said, so how do you make time to write? I said, you're teaching, you've got a young child. And he said, I get up at 4 and I put a pot of coffee on. And he said, I write for 2.5 hours. And then I get my son up, make breakfast. We go to school. I drop him off. I'm in class most of the day. If he's got, some sort of sports practice or something after school, I'll drop him off. And then I'll write for a little bit, and I'll grade papers, and I'll plan for the next day. And then at night, we'll hang out. And he said, and I'll squeeze some more writing in before bed, or if I've got any more papers to grade. And then I start the whole process over the next day.
Yeah.
And I just thought, okay. So, but his point was regular schedule to stay on it.
Yeah, I think there are writers who do, they might have a writing day, a teaching day, or whatever, like a day job day, and then a reading day. There are different ways to chunk it. Some people write middle of the night, some people get up early. I think the most important thing is you find out what your writing life, what works best. Not everybody can get up at 4 a.m. I get a lot of emails from students at 1:30 because they're still up.
Yeah, they never got up though. They're still up.
Exactly. That's when they're productive. So I think you figure out how to fit it in. Is it on the weekends? Is it before work, after work? Or if you're, lucky enough to have some time off, can you work all day, every day, or do you burn out? In which case, do you want to set sort of working hours and then have time where you're not dedicated to not writing? I'm a big believer too in wasting some time. I think that's really productive for creativity.
Sure.
Your subconscious is always motoring away. So you got to figure out, again, the sort of balance.
All right. Well, I've got one more process question for you, and that would be what part of the writing process for you is the most joyous, or conversely, just the part that you dread?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most joyous is the early stages, the kind of magpie stages where you're just pulling in ideas or images or themes, topics, and it all feels, the whole world feels kind of plastic to you. Everything is beautiful and working, and then you get a draft, and then of course the hardest realization is when you read that draft or you have somebody else read the draft and you realize it is just a first draft and it needs a lot of work. So revising is hard, and it's hard for me. And I think things that are quite clear in my mind are almost never clear on the page the first time around. And so it takes often an outside voice to say, like, what are you saying? And then I kind of make helpless gestures and they say, nope, I don't get it. And then okay, I got to go do another second draft. And that second draft can be fun, but a lot of the joy of discovery is gone, because in my head, I feel like I've already figured out what I wanted to say. And now it's a game of sort of rearranging the pieces to get the reader to where I wanted to be. I mean, it's still fun, but there is something wonderful about the early days when it is all promise and joy.
All right, we're going to move on to style. And you're styling right now, but we're talking about writing style. So you talk about time and the impermanence of experience in a number of your works. In the essay Lost and Found, you mentioned the ticking of a clock expressing loss, loss, loss. And in Turtles All the Way Down, you describe turtles as being out of sync with the human world because they run on an older, slower clock. And your desire to preserve special moments with your daughter that will inevitably become part of the past. Are there bigger questions or theories that you have about the time that unites your body of work? And what about the passage of time inspires you?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, like, I think most people, I'm like everyone, I'm living my life forward, right? So it feels like time is winding down. I'm interested in the history and past that sort of erupt into the present. Like a lot of people these days, I think I am worried about the future. So there's a little bit of an apocalyptic imagination that creeps in, and that might be where you're getting some of this loss, which is Tennessee Williams, I should say. It's not my line. I'm quoting him, but the important thing is, you know, if you have to be careful if this is the area you're treading, because that you don't sound like that sad old man at the bar, right? That you don't end up in nostalgia, which is kind of an easy emotion, right? A simple emotion that's not really up to experience, right? It's not complex enough. So I would think that there's as at the same time that I'm dour and suspicious and fearful about where we're heading, when I look back and when I look where we are, that there's also some sort of hope and joy in there. It could be a kind of angry hope or a distrustful hope, but hope nonetheless. Does that answer your question?
No, yeah. No, I get it, and that element of feeling time slipping by, or being aware of time when you have a child of your own, and you're watching that child grow up. I mean, I can relate to it all too well.
It's just facing your own use by date, right? Your own outdatedness, your mortality, which is fine. It's how time works.
In the writing of the history of the future. Oh my gosh! Wait a minute. Writing of the history of the future. I have it right here.
Product placement.
Very own copy from the St. Louis University Library. It's been compared to E.B. White and Rebecca Solnit, who's someone that I've read that you have a personal inspiration from. What are your thoughts on comparisons to people like E.B. White and Rebecca Solnit?
I would certainly take it. I mean, it's quite flattering, right? E.B. White, that his book, This Is New York, was one that I loved and read a lot when I lived in New York, particularly. I even think a writer friend gave me a copy as a wedding present, an old edition. And I love Rebecca Solnit so much for her, the way she mixes the political and the personal, but also her kind of larger pattern making is something I'm attracted to. She has a great quote about hope that I've been clinging to these days, which is that, just speaking of her, and she's of course been incessant on the election in really wonderful ways. I've been always reading her takes as we we're waiting to hear results. We'll sort of timestamp this moment. And she's been very vocal about that. But she says, hope isn't something that's a lottery ticket that you get to clutch on the couch and feel lucky. And I'm paraphrasing here. She says, it's an axe that you use to break down the door in an emergency. And I just love that about her. It's sort of this active, angry hope, but also it's joyful. And yeah, I think she's someone who mixes the personal and the political just really well in a lot of her stuff. So I'll take high praise, in other words.
Yeah, I assumed you weren't going to be like, no, not E.B. White and Rebecca Solnit. I don't want the comparison. But I wonder when you are so inspired by other writers and you're reading them, or not. I mean, do you feel when you're working on a project, do you feel like you need to stay away from certain people because you don't want their work infiltrating your own, even subconsciously, or is that not a concern?
Maybe I avoid contemporary writers who might be working in a similar vein, just because I don't want to, you worry about doing something similar or them throwing you off maybe. But gosh, somebody that I have already learned from, no, I think that's exactly the kind of time that you should go back and be reading. I'm always reading, partly because it's my job in teaching, but there'll be moments where I'm teaching an essay that I think has nothing to do, or a book that has nothing to do with what I'm working on. And suddenly I realize, oh my gosh, this thing I am telling my students is exactly what I need to be doing in my own work. Like, we learn how to write from how we read. And so, no, I don't think, write a book in a vacuum. I would have to be reading something. And of course, what I read, I'll curate to the book. But yeah, I think you have to be in conversation with others while you're writing, even if it's just in your head.
So essays, obviously a personal way of writing, and you said that yours don't pretend to any sort of pure objectivity. So how do you make decisions about voice and tone when you're writing an essay versus other nonfiction works like Buster Keaton, Tempest in a Flat Hat, and the Backwater, excuse me, I always call it the Backwater, the Backwash Squeeze, and other improbable feats?
Yeah, even in those kind of books, so the Buster Keaton book was a biography, but it does have there you go. I do think that there's a persona there that comes to the fore, maybe most in the descriptions of the movies, or I would do little italicized vignettes kind of written in the second person. But certainly in the Backwash Squeeze, which is about people obsessed with the game of bridge, and I try to learn bridge, and I'm sort of, I think there's always a persona in nonfiction, however you do it. So the idea that you could just be a fly on the wall, reporting things neutrally, like that's not quite true. So I think it's not always that I pick who I'm going to be on the page before I start writing. I have to figure it out as I'm writing, no matter what the project is. But whatever emerges there, the me that emerges on the page is still going to be a slice of me, and it's it's not me in full. It's just a side of me. It could be like a thought, an emotion, or a mood that I'm in, and it's just going to be one slice of me in that time and space.
Mm-hmm. We're obviously in a rather strange American moment right now, dealing with the pandemic. Speaking of timestamps, in different ways, in different cities, there's the election going on right now. So in interviews, you've mentioned that your essays come from obsessions, and that you often lean toward exploring ways in which the past exposes the present. You were kind of alluding to that earlier. Do you think that you would write about this present moment, and how do you see the past exposing itself now?
I think it's continuous. I'm not writing much right now, I'll say that. And I have a lot of writers that I know, and even students. It varies, but I would say a lot of people are having a hard time to write. It's difficult times, they're distracting times. I think, what I'm doing now is I'm just taking tons of notes, which is how, it's typically what I do. Like I'm rarely not taking notes, I find. And it's like how years later, I wrote an essay about New York and 9/11, and I could only write big chunks of that essays because I had my notes from 9/11 when I was in New York. I could dig them up. So I'm taking a ton of notes now. I'm not writing much, and I'm trying to let myself off the hook about that. We're in this moment of protest and racial reckoning. We're dealing with an ahistorical president, right, who's possibly on his way out today. I mean, I think the past is incredibly important in terms of figuring out where we are and where we might go. The writer Charlie Baxter, who's a wonderful fiction writer, I heard him give a talk about remembering as a kind of resistance. That remembering can be a radical act these days, and it's not conservative to think about the past, but conservationalist. And I just loved that, because I think that is really important. And you know who wants you to forget about the past? People who have like large corporations or, you know, governments, or people who want things from you often want you to be distracted and not focusing on what's come before. So that's my little political rant there for you.
Oh, yes, and I'm just letting you make it, and I'm just nodding my head. So your work often uses character uses place as a character, and you've taught courses on place at Washington U. You've had the opportunity to travel to some pretty great, cool things, like going on a dinosaur dig and meeting with, I believe it was the astronaut who was the last person to walk on the moon. You were able to retrieve a radioactive rock from a nuclear testing site, which explains why you're glowing today. So what would you suggest for other writers who may not be able to make those kinds of trips, particularly right now, and yet hope to capture the uniqueness of a location or the intimacy of a location?
Yeah, I mean, travel is a great privilege. And I'll say, like, there were lots of times where I couldn't travel for, you know, monetary reasons or time reasons, or, you know, so I don't want writers to think that they always have to go out far to seek their story. You know, it's that cliche, you can see the world in a grain of sand, and maybe you've picked up the grain of sand in your own backyard, right? The key to something big is through the small. You know, you get to the abstract through the specific. And so, I mean, you scratch the surface of any place, and there's, right, who knows what wells up. So sure. I would say, again, it's a focus, it's a habit of attention, I think, and like looking closely at things, even familiar things in your own backyard, or maybe particularly familiar things that you think you know are invariably stranger than you think. And then once you try to articulate that, right, you're off and running. There's an essay or something, a book right there, or story or poem. You don't have to travel far. In fact, I mean, for place writing, we can talk more about it, but you know, a lot of it is Joan Didion has a line about places belonging to whoever loves it most obsessively, and then essentially remakes it in their own image. So the way to love a place is to kind of see yourself in it, which sounds at once solipsistic, but also, you know, that's how it works. We're not going everywhere, any place. You're going to these places through me, right? It's not North Dakota, it's North Dakota through my eyes. It's not that nuclear test site, it's what it's like to be me standing there surrounded by all these atomic tourists. I wrote about St. Louis, where I was living. I wrote about a family home that I knew really well, right? These were places I was in anyway.
Oh, you just led me right to my next question. And I just wanted to say about Joan Didion, who I love, for people who are watching this, who are interested in learning more about creative nonfiction, Joan Didion, whose poster is somewhere behind me right now as a recipient of the St. Louis Literary Award.
There she is.
Years ago. Yeah, amazing. Okay, so here it is. So we've now entered the miscellaneous round. In the essay, "Open Ye Gates, Swing Wide Ye Portals," you describe St. Louis, and this is from the History of the Future, by the way, I'm sorry. You describe St. Louis as a city of gates that do not normally swing wide. St. Louis is a proud city, and in an interview with St. Louis Public Radio, KWMU, the interviewer cautioned listeners that they should hold on to their civic pride, and goes on to say that the essay holds up a mirror to the city that others may not find so flattering. So how do you tell those kinds of truths about well, not just about a place, about anything in your writing. When you're telling the truth in your writing, and it may, that it will be taken in a certain way, and not necessarily in a positive way. How do you adjust to that or deal with it as a writer?
I mean, I think you have to have the courage of your convictions. This isn't a thought off the top of your head, right? So you've thought about it and you've investigated it and you've written some more and you've written. So like, I think you can, I think it is always just your take on something. Someone else can weigh in and disagree with you. But I mean, I think in general, any writing, like all truths are hard. Nothing falls into an easy binary. Like no one's going to read a book where it's either like heroes and villains, right? St. Louis is perfect, St. Louis is problematic, all or nothing. That's not particularly interesting or true to life, right? Feelings are multiple, not singular. You might love something and hate it. You might be hungry and angry, right? Everything, it's not just one. So for St. Louis, there were things that we were new to town when I wrote that essay, and there were things that I just loved, right? It came from a place of fascination and wonder, and there are also things that I was just so uncomfortable with. And those can coexist, and in fact, those should coexist in an essay, and that's what makes it interesting, is that kind of ambivalence. There's a line from Auden that I'm always giving my students, and it's poetry is the clear expression of mixed feelings, right? Your feelings are almost always mixed. You just have to articulate that, and then that's enough, right? Because so I think that essay is hardly a takedown of St. Louis. It might be a takedown of certain lenses or ways of thinking, but it's in some ways it's a love letter to a difficult city.
So it's interesting. I remember Gutkin, again, I'm going to quote from him, when he was saying, when you're writing creative nonfiction, you have to be prepared to kind of out your friends and your family and your coworkers, and he said it can be uncomfortable, and he said, but you have to write the truth, and he said, do you change names? Do you change details? He said, you don't if you're me. He said, you take that risk and you stay true to the art form.
Yeah, I mean, I think this writers will fall on different places on the spectrum in terms of writing about friends or family, or even the ethics of representation. In some ways, you're always going to fall short, right? And I think you can educate your readers and say that this person, if I'm writing about my dad, one of the essays is about my dad. I'll write about my dad. My sister might read that essay and be like, "Yep," she won't say, "Yep, that's our dad." She'll say, "Yep, that's how you see dad," right? And that idea that that's my slice of dad, she would have a different conception of my dad. Sure. We'll stick with writing about family members, can be incredibly uncomfortable. And it's up for the writer to decide how they sleep at night, right? On the one hand, I encourage my students always, like, this is your life. You have a right to this story, your own truth, really embrace that. On the other hand, I wish I could remember who said the quip. It's something like, writing's an art, but it doesn't have to be a martial art. You don't have to go out of your way to hurt somebody, right? And there are writers, I know writers who will change enough details in a piece, and it's different for every piece, right? That's the other thing, is you don't have to decide a blanket approach for every piece. There may be ones where you want to name names, and there may be ones where it's beside the point. But this writer says, I want to say it was maybe Nick Flynn at a conference, said something like, he would change enough details that the person he's writing about, like, say, wouldn't lose their job, right? Wouldn't get fired in terms of doing no harm. And yet he would keep it true enough that there's no way that they couldn't see themselves in the character. In other words, they couldn't squirm out of it and say, that's not me. So that was one bargain he struck at times in his writing. So I think it depends on the difference of the piece, like the aims. There might be political reasons, there might be personal reasons for making these kinds of decisions. But at the end of the day, you always have to sleep at night. It's also, though, impossible to bulletproof your piece, like in terms of not giving offense. I have written what I thought were very kind things about people that they've taken wrongly, and I've written what I thought pretty harsh things about people, and they're fine with it. So you never know, in some ways, what's going to upset somebody. So that can be a permission giver too.
So you mentioned before that your wife is a particularly ruthless reader of your work. and you've received a ton of positive reviews for your publications. But I know, like in a traditional writing workshop, I mean, I know the way I run them, we focus on the positive, but there needs to be an honest critique of how the work can improve. But how do you personally deal with criticism?
Oh, I mean, it's hard. I don't know. I mean, I think most of my writer friends, I mean, there are a few like just egomaniacs out there, but the rest are neurotic and humble and already filled with self-doubt. So of course, I mean, I think it's a basic human thing. 10 people give you a compliment and one person says something bad. All you remember is the bad thing.
It's brutally true. Yeah.
So, I mean, I will say it probably doesn't get easier. I've written lots of emails responding to, like, there's been 1 or 2 reviews that I feel like are willful misreadings, or I still remember one that claimed I got some facts wrong and then got all sorts of facts wrong in the review. And I was, ooh boy, I was ready to like get that correction printed in the newspaper. And then, a steadier hand said, great, you wrote the email, don't send it. Because in some ways it doesn't matter. I mean, isn't it, I think it's Kurt Vonnegut said that like writing a mean review is like putting on a suit of armor to go attack a hot fudge sundae. I mean, it's like all works of art are flawed, and it's a different kind of enterprise than to figure out what to love in it and what to praise in it. And so it doesn't mean that it gets any easier and some criticisms are valid. And I think you do a little soul searching once you get past the initial defensiveness, and then some you set aside. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. Some writers don't even read reviews, which I can't do. I can't not read reviews, but I know writers who don't.
So do you have I mean, every writer has an inner critic. I think at least to some extent. I mean, do you ever find it debilitating, or are you the person who doesn't have one?
No, I mean, again, writers are filled with self-doubt. I do. I think you just have to do a little bit of kind of Roadrunner running off the cliff. You just sort of look forward, you try to flick those demons off your shoulder, and let the momentum sustain you. I mean, at some point you should be critical and self-critical, but maybe that's not during the first draft stage, right? You let yourself make all sorts of mistakes and fall on your face boldly and beautifully when you're just the only one reading it, and then you can revise and be harsh with yourself. I think it's more about sort of figuring out how to keep yourself from shutting yourself down, I think, and there are lots of ways, like procrastination, wasting time, using like other things instead of writing, right? Like research, endlessly going down research rabbit holes can be a way to not write. So I think writers have to be more on guard for those sort of traps, because the self-critic can be useful at times.
Yeah, I mean, I know for me, when I'm teaching my students, I will say, you don't worry about anyone or anything other than getting your thoughts and ideas down as quickly as possible, even putting a timer on, just so you can kind of get that critic off your shoulder, but just plow through that early draft.
Yeah,
and
also, then,
yeah.
Exactly. And you don't have to show anybody what you wrote, in the same way that, like, in a first draft of, we're getting back to writing about others, you can write a draft, fully go for it in the first draft. You don't have to publish it, right? You can dial it back. You can see what you say. But yeah, I mean, I think, right, you got to make writing a regular habit, I think, and that can be a way of dealing with all the things that conspire to silence you.
Sure. So you're a contributing editor for The Spectacle, which is the literary journal created by grad students at Washington University. What role do student journals play in contributing to the literary world, in your opinion? And before you answer that, I just want to put in the good word for St. Louis University's literary magazine called Kiln. It's awesome, just as The Spectacle is. Okay, now.
No, that's great. I mean, I love the journal ecosystem, and it's just, exploded in wonderful ways. So I think, I mean, it's one thing to work on a journal. I think you learn so much about writing and reading, and of course you'll learn some of the practical sides of the business, like solicitations. I think it's a great way to figure out how to make I wasn't going to say a career, but like how to be in the conversation is interesting. I think the journal ecosystem is wonderful. I subscribe to a ton. I wish I had unlimited funds because I would subscribe to so many more. I could turn my computer, but then you would also see the messy pile of papers over there. But I've got them all just stacked up on the floor. And every time I meet with a student, I tell them they have to take a journal, and then when they're done with it, give it to somebody else. It just explodes the possibilities for voices and different kinds of writing, and the idea that there's not just a journal, there are many journals, and the key is finding one that matches your aesthetic. So I mean, I love it. I kind of love everything about them. I think they're great.
So all right, so let me ask you this. So for and I guess this really specifically applies to university students, I guess. I mean, I want to make this more holistic for middle schoolers and high schoolers too, if they're interested in working for a journal or reading for a literary journal. I mean, reading a literary journal. And I guess I would ask you, do you have a starting place for your students?
I mean, part of the reason why well, when they take a journal, sometimes if they've really piled up, I have them take two, and I say, you can take one you've heard of, but you have to take one you've never read before. And anytime students come to me and want to start submitting places, I say, you have to start reading journals you want to submit to. And of course, I was the same way in college, so I'm not criticizing. They start with the writing. They want to be a writer, but they haven't sort of done the reading, and you have to know the conversation you're entering. And even just in terms of like pragmatically submitting to places, you have to know what kind of pieces a journal runs. It'll have a tone, a voice, an aesthetic, and you have to know that whether your piece meshes with it, aside from all the pleasure you would get from reading the journal. So I'm always telling my students, go to your independent bookstore, once we're not quarantined, and go to the section of journals if you're lucky enough to have one, and just take some down and look at them, and read them and figure out like, because there's just so much out there, which is the one that speaks to you, and then that'll give you ideas for, this thing I'm writing, maybe I could submit it here.
And our very own sponsor, Left Bank Books, has a terrific section of literary journals as well.
That was the bookshelf I was picturing in my mind, Ted. Left Bank.
Well, it's the one I was picturing in my mind as well. I was also thinking about our respective university libraries as well.
That's true.
So you've taught a diverse group of individuals and populations, including juvenile offenders at a correctional facility in Minnesota, undergrads and graduates at the University of Minnesota and Washington University, adult learners through the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, which is also at Washington U. What, if anything, have these experiences taught you about the ways that writing can enrich or play a role in your life, no matter what the age?
I mean, I think by becoming better writers, we become better readers. I mean, which is writing and reading. You're learning how to use language. You're learning how to receive language in new ways, which of course is pleasurable, but also allows you to move through the world more fully. By reading and writing, you're educating yourself about your own emotions, right? You're practicing a kind of imaginative empathy. In other words, I think things being the world, just becomes more interesting the more you read and write. And of course, I have a sort of, of course I would say that, right? But I believe it's true. I sort of love learning to write just for the sake of it, aside from whether you'll be published or make a living out of it, etc. There's such great worth in that, particularly it's a way to resist our culture of distraction, right? It kind of slows us down with our thoughts, with ourselves, with others. In a classroom community, you can form these really wonderful creative communities that can then have long lives and sort of sustain themselves. I don't see a downside, I guess.
I've done some work with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, OLLI, and I've always immensely enjoyed working with those groups. They're just as voracious a group of learners as I've ever worked with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I had more time, I would think I would endlessly take classes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would love to take,
sure.
In no way do I pretend that I am done learning ever. So
you've mentioned in some previous interviews that you see yourself as a writer housed in academia. So what inspired you to become an academic?
Yeah, I don't, gosh, it's like, I don't consider I mean, I feel like I am fortunate to be housed in academia.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, I guess I consider myself an academic. I mean, I started, as a lot of creative writers, we sort of back our way into academia. You know, I was a freelancer for like 9 or 10 years, and then I went back and got my MFA, and now I've been teaching, you know, at the university full time for like 9 years. So I'm very fortunate because I love to teach and I love to write, and this is a job that lets me do both and order food and have health insurance, right? So, but like, I don't think you have to be in academia to be a writer, and I think so many voices are outside of academia that are important. So, I guess that answers my question. I mean, I like teaching. If you don't like teaching, you should figure out other ways to be a writer other than to take a job where you have to teach and write, because teaching is so much work that if you don't love it, it's really going to be a grind. And I've seen writers who, you know, go through an MFA program, love the writing, they're incredibly talented, and then through their like student teaching, they realize, you know what, I don't think teaching is my thing, and then they go find other ways to right, put food on the table and have health insurance while continuing the writing. But I feel very grateful to be in the university.
So I love that you talked about the importance of reading as it relates to writing. Of course, they're completely intertwined. So I have to ask the question, what are you reading right now, or at least what's on your nightstand that you would like to get to?
Right. Well, these are even more difficult times. So in terms of distraction and amount of headspace. So I'm always reading for class. So I'm reading a ton of student work, stuff my students are writing, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm also reading all the books that I'm assigning. I think we just finished Baldwin, which we read leading up to the election, James Baldwin. The book I have beside my bed for pleasure right now is a book that I already sort of read, but I'm dipping back into. It's Ross Gay's Book of Delights. It seems like a perfect companion to the pandemic and these days of protest in a lot of ways. So he set I don't know if you've read it, but he's a poet, and this is his book of nonfiction, but he set a challenge for himself to write an essay every day for a year about a particular delight. And that sounds kind of maybe more upbeat than it really is, because he'll have angry delights, but it'll always sort of circle back to a delight, whatever that is, some sort of sparking some sort of joy, I guess, to use our terms. But it's a really wonderful book, and they're serious, they're funny, they're silly, they're like incredibly dire, and they're wonderful, and they're short, so I can read it right before I go to bed as a way of kind of cleansing my mind of everything else, and then I can sleep at night. So I like that book a lot right now. Ross Gay, Book of Delights. And then I'm also reading a few things for next semester's teaching. But
so what's I'm gonna ask a music question in a moment, but it occurred to me I need to ask you about your writing space. Do you have a specific writing space, or do you mix it up?
We're in my office on campus right now because we're Zooming and I need the speedy, quick internet here. I'll do writing here. I wish I could be more precious about my writing space. But one of the things I've learned is that you have to write when time and the world grant you the space to do it. So, I mean, I love my office here. It's the same place where I do meet students and do a lot of grading and read applications. So it's not like it's, sort of sanctified just for writing. It's everything. It's where I work. And I think it is important to think of writing as a job. It sort of demystifies and de-romanticizes it. And when I was younger, I used to think I could only write in my specific notebook with the wind in my hair at dusk, but no. Like, you write when you can, and that's how it happens. I do have an office at home too, that of course I love, and is also filled with little totems of superstition and meaning that I collect around myself. And I share that with my wife and my daughter. Like, we all use the same office. It's kind of great. But that's it. I'm not a cafe writer. That would be the one thing I say. I have to be more or less alone to write.
I just spoke with another writer about the cafe writer. We were talking about Richard Russo, kind of renowned for coffee house hopping on the East Coast, and which I kind of love too. I mean, I like writing by myself, but I love writing in coffee houses.
I think you just have to find what works for you. I absolutely know people who can't be alone and get tremendous amount of work done in coffee shops, and I in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking like, oh, should I order another cookie? Like, how long can I sit on this cup of coffee? Is everyone staring at me? Are they wondering why I haven't typed something in a while?
Only the staff.
Exactly.
No
Yeah.
one else
So
cares.
I got to be alone.
All right. Speaking of when you're writing, do you listen to music when you're writing?
Usually not. I wrote my first book to kind of a soundtrack, and I can't remember. I think it was born out of desperation. I mean, I was living in a tiny apartment in New York, and I was writing, literally sitting cross-legged on my bed on a laptop with all my research spread out in front of me because I had no office, right? I just had a room. So that one I wrote pretty much because it was the Buster Keaton biography, and it was focused on the 20s. And so I wrote the whole book at all this like hours and hours and hours of Django Reinhardt. So it's like swing guitar, gypsy jazz from the 20s.
Yeah, from that time period. Great.
And I love him. And I loved Reinhardt going in. And I thought like, this will be maybe something of the like jauntiness will find its way into the prose, because that was a lot of what I was attracted into Buster Keaton was both the darkness, but also the sort of heady early days of things. The problem is though, I did that for like as long as it took to write that book, and now I can't hear Django Reinhardt in a lot of ways. It's just white noise to me. It's like you put it on and the world recedes, but I don't actually get to hear the individual songs because I just heard them on loop forever. It actually took my daughter, who was like playing with the iPod, and she clicked on some songs and it made me sort of listen to them anew. But otherwise, no, I try to not have music on. I can't have the TV on. Just silence.
So, and I just because I'm curious, when you're working out, do you listen to music?
No, I sound so lame. I do not. Like I jog or no headphones in. I like to sort of, although I will at the gym just to sort of drown out the people around me.
Right. And
then it's like a playlist. I mean, I'm trying to think at home now because my wife and I have a 9, almost 10-year-old. The music used to be ours. We used to have our fingers on the button, and now we've lost a lot of control. So like my daughter,
I was gonna say that's
she's like, I mean, it's kind of sweet. She has a good working knowledge of like new wave, but she doesn't want to hear it. And so like lately I was playing some Motown, a playlist my dad sent us once, which was good because it was like all new to her. And I was like, oh, this is the stuff Daddy had to listen to and got sick of growing up, just like you feel the same way about certain bands from the 80s. But also it means that like we're constantly making room for Hamilton, which is an ongoing enthusiasm of my dad.
Right. All right, so I've got one more question for you. We are steaming toward the holiday of Christmas, and apparently, rumor has it you've done well enough for both Santa and Hanukkah Harry to grant you 3 wishes, but they all have to do with writing and literature. So sorry. So you've got 3 wishes to make, but they're all writerly wishes. So Edward, what are they?
Well, the first two are easy. And I feel like it's what every writer wants. And so number 1 would be time, and number 2 would be space to write. I mean, that's all my writers, of course, want money, but they just want money in order to convert it to time and space. To not have to work another job, to like get a little room of their own somewhere. I mean, that is sort of the currency that they want. So time and space would be what I would ask for. And then my 3rd wish would maybe be, particular to this moment, some sort of proximity to people. Which I also think is important for writing and literature. It would be nice to close the social distance a little bit. So here's hoping in terms of the pandemic and everything else. Because this actually, we can go full circle here, Ted. We were talking at the beginning about writing as like a solitary endeavor you do with a social end. So like, I want the time and space, like a lot of writers, to remove myself from the world, but I also am deeply invested in the world and other readers and finding readers and being a reader. So like, the idea of proximity to people would be something that would be really nice. I mean, look at us, we're doing this over Zoom. Wouldn't it be nice to,
I know,
we're like, being alone together, just the theme of this. It'd be nice to be in a room with other people.
It would be nice, and hopefully next year, as the series continues, I'll be in the same room with people. It would be splendid. Well, I cannot thank you enough for sitting down and talking with me.
Well, thanks so much to you, Ted, for having me, and also to anybody still listening. I'm very grateful.